Hey everyone, it's Emily, and today I'm going to be doing my second part to my February wrap-up. So I'll be sure to link the first one below, as well as the vlog that I did where I talk about some of these books. But we're here to wrap up the rest of what I read in February. So let's just jump right in. First, I read both Strange the Dreamer and Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor. I'm just going to hold up Strange the Dreamer because... yeah. So I started this one in a vlog that I did, so as I said, I'll be sure to link that down below. And I freaking love this series. I love it so much. So as I said, this is by Laini Taylor. This follows Laszlo, who is a librarian and is very familiar, or likes to study, the lost city of Weep. He knows that that's not the name of the city, but the name and the details of the city have just kind of been stripped from people's minds. And so he's kind of one of the only ones that kind of knows that this needs to be investigated and that he wants to figure out what's going on. And at one point there's an envoy that comes from this lost city asking for help, and he's able to go to the lost city of Weep to kind of figure out what's going on, and it just kind of goes from there. And there's so much I loved about this entire series. I'm just going to talk about both of them together, because I can't really talk about kind of the plot of the second one anyway, because I don't want to spoil too much. I don't want to say much more about what these books are actually about, but I'll just kind of talk about both of the books as a whole. So I think my favorite part of this entire duology is the first half of this book because I absolutely loved getting to know Laszlo. I fell in love with this character. He's just such a cinnamon roll. Like, I freaking love him. And it's just so cool to see him grow over the series. And, you know, once he gets to the city, you know, it's just so cool to see all of these elements come together. And I also really loved kind of how that came together in the second half of Muse of Nightmares, all these different threads that you're following throughout the story and how they all come together and how the world just really, really expands in Muse of Nightmares, and there's so much else that's going on that Laini kind of draws in. So I absolutely love that. I will say that the main romantic elements of this were fine for me, but nothing that I like swooned over or that I'll necessarily remember as the favorite parts of this series for me, which is probably not how I think most people feel based on how many people I've heard talk about that. But it personally wasn't my favorite part of the series. I really liked how they met, and I love the writing surrounding them because Laini Taylor's writing is just phenomenal and gorgeous all the time, forever, always. So I like the way that they met, and I thought that was super interesting in their kind of initial interactions and connection. But that turned to love real fast for me. But they're cute, they're really sweet, and I really like the writing surrounding them. So like, it wasn't anything that I like disliked by any means, or certainly wasn't anything that drew away enjoyment for the story. It just wasn't something that I'm gonna remember as my favorite part of the story, which I just don't think is necessarily a common response. I will say that I am really excited. So I listened to the audiobook, and Steve West narrates, who is fantastic. I love him. He also narrated, I think I mentioned this in the vlog, but he also narrated the Crown's Game duology, and I really loved him in that too. So would definitely recommend these on audio, and that's primarily how I listened to them. I didn't read these physically much as I was listening. But I am definitely excited to go back and read these physically and kind of annotate her gorgeous writing and take note of just some key parts that I think I'm going to reread a lot. So I'm definitely excited to reread these. Like, it's going to happen. I'm going to reread these and reread them physically so that I can do that. Or physically while listening to the audio or something. Whatever. I love these. So the next book that I finished, I checked out from the library, so I don't have a physical copy anymore, but I'll put an image here, and that is The Way We Eat Now by B. Wilson. And this was a really, really interesting nonfiction book about the food system, and it's a very particular, not angle, but a very particular discussion being held around the food system. So it's not necessarily about how the food system works. It's not about how to make the food system more sustainable or kind of the sustainability issues with the food system, which is one thing that could have been discussed when I just hear, okay, I'm going to read a book about the food system. I read this for a book club, so I just wasn't really sure what to expect going in. But it wasn't that. It is instead a discussion about the social aspects of the food system and how that interacts with kind of the problems that the food system has right now. And so it was, it's a much so it doesn't, for example, discuss like how climate change is going to impact the food system or the ethics of the food system in terms of, like, for example, how animals are treated. It doesn't really talk much about that, if that's kind of what you're looking for in a book about the food system or what you're interested in. This doesn't talk about that, but this does talk about, for example, differential access to nutrition-filled food. So she talks about how there is an increase in the number of people who get enough calories in a day, but there's still also a rise in the number of people who are not getting enough nutrients out of those calories, and kind of the health problems associated with that. So she talks about, different social things that are happening, different policies that are affecting kind of how people have different access to food and how problematic that is. She talks a lot about advertising and food companies and how that affects what people eat, how people eat it, where people have access to that kind of food. She talks about how diets across the world are becoming kind of more uniform as food companies grow and kind of sell their food across the world. She talks about how we talk about and relate to diets. She talks about how information about food is shared and how there's more information being shared about food, or it's being shared faster through social media than at any time before, and kind of how that affects what we eat and kind of the demands that places on the food system. She also talks a lot about the economics of the food system and how there is so much going on that can affect the decisions that a family or individual person might make about the food that they eat. And talks, for example, about how vegetables, it's not just a matter of telling a family eat more vegetables, because if you actually look at the data on how much vegetables cost relative to other foods that can at least put some calories into someone's kids, if they only have so much money to stretch to kind of feed their family for a week. She talks about the reality of just how prices for something like vegetables have changed over time, and how it is just not realistic to just be able to tell a family eat more vegetables and have that kind of be a reality. So she talks a lot about the economics of food and how just people's daily life play a role in what food they eat. It was super interesting. I thought it was incredibly well written, and I definitely learned some things weren't necessarily a surprise, but there definitely were some things that were definitely an interesting discussion or something else or a different angle that I hadn't really thought about or read about much. And I just thought it was a really interesting book. So the next book that I read, I don't have a physical copy, but it is the second book in the Darker Shade of Magic series, and that is A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab. So I listened to this one on audio, and it actually was at first a little bit jarring because they switched narrators. So it was one male narrator with a British accent for the first book, and then it switched to two narrators, which I actually really appreciate that they kind of brought in a different narrator for some of the female perspectives, and it was just such a change that it took me a moment to kind of get used to. The narrators are fantastic though. It's Michael Kramer and Kate Reading, and they're phenomenal. They are legends in terms of audiobook narrating. I think they do a lot of Brandon Sanderson's books. I think they did The Wheel of Time. They've done a lot and they're wonderful. It just took me a moment to kind of get used to the audiobook. And this one, so the first half of A Gathering of Shadows I think was a bit of a surprise to me because it was a lot slower than Darker Shade of Magic was, and the characters are kind of in different places than they were in this one for plot reasons that I don't want to get into. And so it was kind of different to kind of see it was cool to see different places in the world and kind of get to know those characters a little bit more. And we're introduced to some new characters as well. And we're introduced to one new main character that I really, really like. And, but it was a lot slower, and I think she took her time kind of letting you sit with the characters a little bit more and sitting with the world a little bit more, but it was definitely a lot slower. So if you were expecting the first half of I'd say that book to be kind of the same pace as A Darker Shade of Magic. You might be in for a little bit of a surprise. I will say though that the second half of it picks it right back up, and yeah, I really picks back up. I loved the second half of A Gathering of Shadows, and then it definitely brought me right back into everything. And you can also kind of see throughout the second book, you can also kind of see where the rest of the series is going to go. So it's definitely kind of cool to see the world expand, see the characters in new situations. I love Delilah Bard with all of my heart, and she's one of my new favorite characters ever. She's just so much fun. But overall, I definitely had a lot of fun listening to this one. And spoiler alert, I also listened to the third one, so I'm trying to just leave it at what I thought about A Gathering of Shadows. But I did genuinely enjoy the second one overall, and I think I did a good job setting up the third one. Just get through the first half, and like it's smooth sailing for the rest of the series. I did also really enjoy the romantic elements in this series, including specifically in A Gathering of Shadows. Like, they're definitely setting up, it's not the focus of the series by any means, and I kind of like that it's well developed enough, and that the characters, you get to know the characters individually well enough, that it's not really a leap to kind of see their connections with other people. And so they're like, I like how she did the romantic elements of this series a lot. It's present in a good way, the characters are really well developed, and you know, those connections are very believable, but it's not in your face, it's not, you know, the main point of the series, and it's not anything. If you don't like romantic elements in your series, I don't think it would be anything that would detract from your enjoyment of the series. It might just not be something that is like the part that you enjoy the most, but I really like the romantic elements in this one, which is kind of hard for a series to do for me. So loved it. I loved it overall. Also, forgot to actually mention kind of a plot synopsis for this super briefly. So you follow Kel, and he is called an Antari, is kind of the magician type that he is. He is one of very few people who can travel between 4 parallel Londons that have different levels of magic, and he occasionally smuggles things in between these different Londons, and at one point smuggles something that really kind of gave him more than he bargained for in terms of consequences, and so he kind of needs to deal with the ramifications of that powerful object that he smuggled. Just read it. The next book that I listened to on audio was the last book in the Ash Princess series, and that is Ember Queen by Laura Sebastian. So this series follows Theo, and her mother is the queen of her land. Their land was kind of taken over by a different group. Most of the people that were in Theo's family were killed, but she was actually kept alive so that if her people ever rebelled against the people who took over their land, she would be publicly beaten. So she was kind of used as a way to kind of control her people. And something happens towards the beginning of this first book that really cements her desire to kind of make sure that she can get out of her situation and help her people. And you know, the rest of the series kind of follows her trying to do that. And I talked about the second one. The second one really focused more, so this one is kind of an action start to the series. The second one really opens up the politics of the world, and it's definitely a slower book, but I thought the politics was super interesting, and so, you know, it definitely had a different flavor. But I really, really liked meeting these different groups and kind of getting introduced more to the politics of how she was actually going to, you know, help her people, and the politics is very important to that. So I really could kind of see the third book in this series gearing up to be a really, really exciting conclusion if Laura was able to combine that action and the politics in a really cool way for those two elements to come together. And I think she really succeeded with that in the third book. I love Theo's character growth over this entire series. And yeah, I just think she really kept the politics incredibly interesting, and just the action is also really, really back in this third one, and I think it's just so cool to kind of follow these. I fell in love with quite a few of the characters over the course of the series, and it's just so cool to kind of see them grow together, and just kind of face the decisions that they need to face. And I really thought it was a really cool conclusion, and I could definitely see myself rereading this series or re-listening to it. I really would recommend the audiobooks. Saskia did a phenomenal job narrating this series, and I just absolutely loved her. I thought she was perfect for this series, and yeah, I could see myself rereading it. Honestly, like, I had such a good time, and really thought the third one brought everything home. So at first I wasn't sure if it would. I thought this could be a series that would be fun and entertaining, and one that I was glad that I read, but not necessarily one that I think would stick with me as much as I think it will and has recently. So I really would recommend this series. The last book that I read in the month of February was A River of Royal Blood by Amanda Joy. I read this one physically, and this one I also wanted to make sure I read this month for Black History Month, and I overall enjoyed this one. There are quite a few elements of this that I really, really liked. I thought the writing was pretty strong. I really loved and am intrigued by the world. I think there are some super interesting groups of people, super interesting use of magic, and so those parts really intrigued me. I will say though that I thought the pacing was a lot slower than I thought it would be, although it's kind of hard to judge exactly what kind of pacing you can expect from a book, but it was pretty slowly paced, and usually that means that there's a lot of character work done and that you really fall in love with the characters first, and then especially if it's a series, you kind of fall in love with the characters first, and then you can kind of care about what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing. That can kind of help you understand their motivations. But I wasn't super compelled by a lot of these characters. They're definitely, like, the species are definitely interesting, and kind of the dynamics between the different groups of people that exist in this world I think were super interesting, and you kind of get a lot of that history in this first book. But I think for the pacing, I don't think I got enough out of the characters to kind of overcome it being pretty slowly paced. Like, I can enjoy a character-based fantasy novel, but I don't think the character work was quite there to make the pacing worth it, or make it kind of overcome the slow pacing for me. But I am definitely intrigued to continue with this series. Like, I'm intrigued enough by the world, and I'm wanting to see if potentially this was just kind of setting up the world and the magic and kind of getting you a glimpse into the action that could happen in the rest of this series, and I want to see if that could pay off. So I'm definitely intrigued enough to keep going, just kind of see what happens. I will say too that I was kind of neutral about the romantic elements in this one. Like, they were fine, but again, because I wasn't super compelled by the characters, I also wasn't super compelled by those romantic elements. So, this one is we'll see how I feel about the series as I continue to read it, but I'm intrigued enough to do so. So, that's where I'm at. So that's it. Those are the books that I read in the second half of February. And let me know if you've read any of these and what you thought, or if you agree with any of my thoughts on these, mostly series. I think is mostly what I worked on in the second half of February. So if you've read any of these series or any of these books, let me know what you thought. Be sure to subscribe for more bookish content, and I'll be sure to link Twitter, Instagram, all that good stuff down below. That's where I like to hang out. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.